Page 205. Maureen Quilling had had the worst week of her life. Nick Farthing was no longer speaking to her. Her Uncle Tam had just shouted at her about the Owens kid thing, then told her not to mention anything about that evening, ever, to anyone, as he could lose his job, and he wouldn't want to be in her shoes if that happened. Her parents were furious with her. She felt betrayed by the world. Even the year of sevens weren't scared of her any longer. It was rotten. She wanted to see that Owens kid, who she blamed for everything that had happened to her so far, writhing in miserable agony. If he thought being arrested was bad, and then she would concoct elaborate revenge schemes in her head, complex and vicious. They were the only thing that made her feel better, and even they didn't really help. If there was one job that gave Mo the creeps, it was cleaning up the science labs and putting away the Bunsen burners, making sure that all the test tubes, petri dishes, and unused filter papers and the like were returned to their places. She only had to do it on a strict rotation system, once every 2 months. But it stood to reason that here, in the worst week of her life, she would be in the science lab. At least Mrs. Hawkins, who taught several general sciences, was there, collecting papers, gathering up things at the end of the day. Having her there, having anybody there, was comforting. "You're doing a good job, Maureen," said Mrs. Hawkins. A white snake in a jar of preservatives stared blindly down at them. Mo said, "Thanks." "Aren't there supposed to be 2 of you?" asked Mrs. Hawkins. "I was supposed to be doing it with the Owens kid," said Mo, "but he hasn't been to school in days now." The teacher frowned. "Which one was he?" she asked. "I don't have him down on my list." "Bob Owens, brownish hair, a bit too long, didn't talk much. He was the one who named all the bones in the skeleton quiz. Remember?" "Not really," admitted Mrs. Hawkins. "You must remember. Nobody remembers him, not even Mr. Kirby." Mrs. Hawkins pushed the rest of the sheets of paper into her bag and said, "Well, I appreciate you doing it on your own, dear. Don't forget to wipe down the working surfaces before you go." And she went, closing the door behind her. The science labs were old. There were long, dark wooden tables and gas jets, taps, and sinks built into them. There were dark wooden shelves upon which were displayed a selection of things in large bottles. The things that floated in the bottles were dead, had been dead for a long time. There was even a yellowed human skeleton in one corner of the room. Mo didn't know if that was real or not, but right now it was creeping her out. Every noise she made echoed in the long room. She turned all of the overhead lights on, even the light on the whiteboard, just to make the place less scary. The room began to feel cold. She wished she could turn up the heat. She walked over to one of the large metal radiators and touched it. It was burning hot, but still she was shivering. The room was empty and unsettling in its emptiness, and Mo felt as if she were not alone, as if she were being watched. "Well, of course I'm being watched," she thought. 100 dead things in jars were all looking at me, not to mention the skeleton. She glanced up at the shelves. That was when the dead things in the jars began to move. A snake with the unseeing milky eyes uncoiled in its alcohol-filled jar. A faceless, spiny sea creature twisted and revolved in its liquid home. A kitten, dead for decades, showed its teeth and clawed the glass. Mo closed her eyes. "This can't be happening," she told herself. "I'm imagining it." "I'm not frightened," she said aloud. "That's good," said someone standing in the shadows by the rear door. "It seriously sucks to be frightened." She looked at him. "None of the teachers even remember you." But you remember me, said the boy, the architect of all of her misfortunes. She picked up a glass beaker and she threw it at him, but her aim went wide and it smashed against a wall. How's Nick? Asked Maud, as if nothing had happened. You know how he is, she said. He won't even talk to me. He just shuts up in class, goes home, and does his homework. Probably building model railways. Good, he said. And you, she said, you haven't been at school for a week. You're in such trouble, Bob Owens. The police came in the other day. They were looking for you. That reminds me, how is your Uncle Tam? Said Maud. Mo said nothing. In some ways, said Maud, you've won. I'm leaving school. In other ways, you haven't. Have you ever been haunted, Maureen Quilling? Ever looked in the mirror wondering if the eyes looking back at you were yours? Ever sat in an empty room and realized that you're not alone? It's not pleasant. You're going to haunt me? Her voice trembled. Maud said nothing at all. He just stared at her. In the far corner of the room, something crashed. Her bag had slipped off the chair onto the floor, and when she looked back, she was alone in the room. Or at least, there was nobody that she could see in there with her. Her way home was going to be very long and dark. If you want to hear the rest of this story, please check it out in the library, The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman.